I think tend to dissociate the parts of the brain that are involved with social engagement as being something not in the brain. It's something psychological that has nothing to do with very specific brain circuits. And, I think, we need a paradigm shift, I think, in our society.
Now, the way you really start digging into this and exploring the social brain is through our neurodegenerative disease called FTD.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could explain what FTD is and just give us a good tight definition and understanding of it.
Great. Well, FTD, or frontotemporal dementia, is the most common neurodegenerative disease in people under the age of 65. This is, kind of shocking to hear because most have never heard about this illness. What is different about this than Alzheimer's disease, which tends to start in memory areas, is frontotemporal dementia attacks in a relentless way the anterior frontal lobes and the anterior temporal lobes, which make up this very important circuit, which allows us to put off reward, stop from doing things that we shouldn't do, prevent us from drinking things that we shouldn't, empathize with other people. So what we see is a decay. Sometimes I think of it as a moral decay, but it's a decay related to the loss of function in this very specific area. I think it's easy to understand when someone develops a memory problem, that it relates to an area in the brain, the hippocampus. But it's not so easy for people when there is a psychological issue to attribute it to a degenerative disease.
Right.
Our research criteria, which we develop for it, ask us to determine whether someone has become disinhibited or addictive. Have they become apathetic? Have they lost empathy for other people? Have they started to overeat? Have they developed compulsive behaviors? And I think from that list of our research criteria, these are not things that people, when they see these symptoms in someone they love, immediately jump to the idea that this is neurodegenerative. They think midlife crisis. But, when we look at the brain with an MRI, and this is what fascinated me from the time of my fellowship, we see loss of these relatively silent areas in the brain, right side more than left often. And so if someone suddenly becomes addictive with alcohol or drugs, my assumption is not that this is psychological, but I think immediately, and I think our whole medical system, if we're going to recognize this, has to shift. So we have to begin to recognize that, changes in who someone is do not happen unless there's a chemical or a structural disturbance in the brain.
Okay. You talked a little bit ago about almost the alterization of brain disease, but we think about Alzheimer's usually hitting people in the latter half of their life, but FTD is not in the same boat, is it?
No, we see it. The average age of onset in the populations I've studied is around 50. So this is a bit younger. These are people who are at work, have big expectations in work and family, and suddenly start to decline in ways that people find very unsettling and mysterious.
Okay. One of the things I really like what you did in the book is you brought in real world stories. It's not just a scientific study, but you really helped make it relatable by giving personal type stories. And one of the first that you had is with Jamie. And I wonder if you can give us the Jamie story, if you would, please.
Yeah. Well, I was asked to see a woman who many years later we determined had a genetic mutation that had caused her behavior.
And what kind of behavior was she having?
So Jamie, I think the most striking aspect of Jamie was her cruelty and her disinhibition. she had one of the most remarkable caregivers that I had ever seen, a man who had been in the Army, and looked after Jamie in an exquisitely beautiful fashion. But Jamie was unbelievably cruel to him. She said things that were cruel. Sometimes she even did physically cruel things like throw coffee at her husband. She lost interest in her business. She lost interest in her finances and actually got into financial trouble. And Jamie came from this remarkable family where people were very successful in early life, but then things fell apart.
Huh.
Remember, one of her aunts was very famous for designing a doll that was very popular. This woman in her 40s or 50s went bankrupt, was reputed to have burned down a factory to get insurance. Eventually, in her 50s, ended up institutionalized. For Jamie, the caregiver was never going to let her be institutionalized. He just was a fierce friend and advocate. But
Okay.
Jamie really deteriorated.
Well, okay. So let's talk about what was going on in her brain that was causing this.
Yeah. So when I looked at Jamie's brain, it was the most, we use the term atrophic, the most loss of tissue I had ever seen in the front of brain
Huh.
in my relatively young career at that time. In particular, the right anterior temporal lobe was just shrunken, as was the right frontal lobe. And so I began to understand these behaviors that I never before would have classified as neurologically,
Hmm.
uh, as suddenly something that was explainable by loss of function in these parts of the social brain that she was losing. So that to me was a total change in my entire career. I want to understand why Jamie's family had this remarkable deterioration, began to think about the genetics of this condition, and
Right, right.
really began to probe behavior in a very different way.
And I hadn't been thinking about this genetically, but it sounds like there certainly is a genetic linkage, at least in this case.
Yes, we say about 20% of our cases have a gene that is highly penetrant. That means, you are likely to get this disease when you reach your 50s or 60s, and sometimes even younger. So
Hmm.
sometimes with these mutations, people can develop this in their 20s or 30s. And you can imagine almost no one thinks that a 20-year-old who is suddenly misbehaving has a degenerative disease of the brain.
And I'm assuming at this stage, there's nothing that could be done to reverse the damage that's been done.
We have, unlike Alzheimer's, we have not one single drug yet that has proven efficacious in slowing the process. But I would also add that this is the most exciting time in my lifetime in terms of getting basic scientists to think about these genes and thinking about ways of curing the illness associated with the gene. We work with a young neurologist named Claire Cleland, and who was mentored by our Nobel laureate Jennifer Doudna. And we think that with the CRISPR technology, we can cut out these bad genes
Oh my gosh.
and absolutely eliminate this disorder. Polio disappeared. We think these diseases can disappear with the right therapy.
And okay, interesting. All right,
Yes.
let's get into your next patient because I think it just really brings these stories to life. Let's hear about Thomas.
Yeah. Uh, so Thomas was a gentleman whose major symptoms related to rigidity, remarkable rigidity, and loss of empathy.
Okay,
So
tell me what you mean by rigidity.
yeah, I'll give you a Thomas example, which
Okay.
they were all so startling. It was just hard to believe. But Thomas was a very religious man. And like a lot of people whose disease begins in the right anterior temporal lobe, become more rigid in their beliefs. If they're atheists, they're more rigidly atheistic. If they're
I see.
religious Christian, more rigid. So Here's an example of Thomas's rigidity. There's a major flood in his rural town. It's Sunday. All of the people, including the minister of his church, are down at the river with sandbags trying to protect the city from a flood.
Okay.
Thomas is the only one in the church, infuriated. He talked to me about this many times, that everyone had lost their religion, and he was the only one in church on that day,
Huh.
and could in no way understand. Really, he could not understand why people on Sunday, where it was a time of worship, needed to be there. During the Super Bowl, good friends of his had a small betting pool for $5. Thomas raged at his friends about this irreligiosity on Super Bowl day, how wrong it was, and you can imagine lost many of his friends. Yeah,
Oh, goodness.
yeah,
Okay. And so what did you see when you looked at his brain and you did an MRI? What did you see?
yeah. One of the things about the brain in these patients is sometimes the damage is very small and very focal. And I think that's what astounded all of us about Thomas was most of the brain worked well. And in fact, he worked in IT very effectively until his behavioral problems became so disabling that he could no longer do this. So most of the brain worked fine, language, perception, but he lost the ability to experience emotion the way we do. His loss of empathy for his wife was astounding. One example, one morning she cut off the tip of her finger. We all feel a sense of sadness and horror when we hear about this. Thomas didn't react that way. Thomas walked back into the house, said, I'm going to get my wallet because I don't want to get a ticket on the way to the hospital. He comes out of the house. His wife is crying. He asks her to stop. You're embarrassing me with our neighbors. Then suddenly stops again, picks up the clippers, walks across the street to the neighbor, gives the neighbor the clippers and says, here you go. I'm going to be gone for a while. You can use these while we're not around.
Mm.
So, the remarkable thing about this is all of the doctors and psychologists who saw Thomas thought that the problem was in his wife, not in Thomas. It shows you how we tend to see behavior.
My goodness. Okay. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to keep going down the patient list because I think it's a
Yes.
good way to explain the story. Let's get into Clark.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, I was still a fellow when I saw Clark. And Clark was a very wealthy, refined man who came from the South. He worked at a major foundation. Um, uh, Eventually, he was so disorganized, so disinterested in the work that he was let go.
And how
Um,
old was Clark at this point?
he was in his early 60s. Uh,
Okay.
and so Clark got arrested. And I think as we've studied these diseases, we've learned that many people, because of their loss of judgment and their what we would call disinhibition, inability to uh, stop a response that the society won't like. About 40% of people with this commit antisocial acts that either do or could lead them to be arrested. So
Okay.
Clark, the
Wow.
first
40%.
yeah, it's huge. It's huge,
That is.
and it shows you that we don't entirely have free will, and our free will is really taken from us. In particular, if the frontal lobes are not working. And so Clark was driving under the influence and actually took a swing at a female policeman. And so his wife came to me and wanted to know uh, whether Clark was really responsible for the crimes that he committed.
Okay. Interesting question.
Yes, yes, yes. It's really a hard one. In Clark, it wasn't so hard. And again, Clark had massive atrophy in the frontal lobes, very disturbed.
Now, you make the case in this part of the book where our legal system isn't necessarily taking into account a defendant's brain functioning. And should that be happening more? And if so, how do you enable that?
Yeah, I think it's really a great question and a double-edged sword. So for my patients, the answer is almost always, the crimes they commit, they would not be responsible for. They don't have the apparatus in the brain to prevent them from committing these crimes. Most of them are petty and silly, walking into a store hungry, see the store owner watching them. They go and eat ice cream out of their freezer and then walk out. Driving through a red light, even though a policeman was watching. But I, so I think they're a combination of disinhibition, poor judgment. But some of them can be more serious, and the frontal lobes are very important for our ability to inhibit a crime.
Mm,
But then how much does this transfer to all legal cases? And I think
right.
that's where this becomes much more complicated. And do people
Because everybody that's accused of a crime is going to want to have a brain scan.
absolutely everyone, and in my perspective, maybe they should. And I
Okay.
think we're beginning to understand much more behavior in the brain.